A tragic accident is something no one can be insured against. In an instant, an unforeseen event can occur that radically changes one's entire life. However, not everyone is capable of accepting the loss of a loved one, and sometimes such an accident triggers a chain of even more horrific events. On the evening of July 1, 2016, a Friday, 34-year-old Roberta Smorgassi was hurrying to her mother's house. The woman had spent the day taking care of various matters and was now planning to visit her relatives with some important, joyful news. She dreamed of preparing a festive dinner and gathering the whole family around the holiday table. Filled with excitement and impatience, Roberta decided to reach her parents' home on her scooter to get there faster. Before leaving, she managed to call her mother and let her know she would arrive soon. Unfortunately, this meeting was never meant to happen. Riding her scooter, the woman approached the intersection of Corso Marzine and Via Giulio Cesare streets. The traffic light showed green, allowing her to continue. In the parallel lane, 21-year-old Italo Delisa was driving a Fiat Punto. Despite the red light for his direction, the young driver ignored it and continued driving. He failed to see the scooter operated by Roberta, resulting in a collision. The powerful impact threw the woman against a traffic light pole, after which she fell onto the road surface. The force of the collision was so strong that Roberta was thrown all the way to the pedestrian area. After the initial impact, Italo's car crashed into another vehicle, a Renault Clio traveling in the opposite lane. The drivers and passengers of the cars sustained minimal injuries, while Roberta suffered critical trauma from hitting her head on the hard road surface. The young driver who caused the accident was in shock but didn't flee the scene and tried to help the victim. Witnesses immediately called emergency services. When medical personnel arrived at the scene, they found the woman lying in the pedestrian area with severe head injuries. The victim was still alive and fighting for her life. Doctors attempted to stabilize her condition right there, but understood that without specialized medical equipment, chances of survival were slim. Roberta was urgently loaded into an ambulance and rushed at maximum speed to the hospital in Vasto, Italy. Throughout the journey, medical staff made every effort to maintain the woman's vital functions. Immediately upon arrival at the medical facility, the victim was taken to the operating room for emergency surgery. Despite all the doctors' efforts, they couldn't save Roberta's life. She died right after being delivered to the hospital due to critical injuries. The official cause of death was severe traumatic brain injury resulting from the head impact on the road surface. The person responsible for the accident, Fiat driver Italo Delisa, was also taken to the medical center. Medical examination showed that the young man had only superficial scratches. There was no one else in his car at the time of the accident. The Renault driver also suffered almost no injuries. After treating minor wounds, Italo underwent mandatory testing for alcohol and drugs in his system. The young man didn't object to the tests, insisting he hadn't consumed any prohibited substances. He expressed deep regret about what happened, explaining that he had lost concentration and accidentally ran the red light, failing to notice the small scooter with Roberta. Toxicology test results confirmed his words. No traces of alcohol or drugs were found in the young man's blood. The guy behaved calmly and adequately, clearly understood the situation, and sincerely repented for what had happened. When told that the accident victim hadn't survived, he couldn't hold back tears. Italo didn't try to avoid responsibility but insisted that everything happened due to a tragic accident. Of course, this couldn't console the deceased's family. Roberta's mother was waiting for her daughter at home but never saw her arrive. The worried woman tried to call her daughter but couldn't reach her. She then contacted Roberta's husband, who informed her about the terrible accident. When the family learned of the tragedy, everyone was devastated and blamed the careless driver for the woman's death. But no amount of blame could bring Roberta back to life. 9 months before this tragedy, Roberta Smorgassi had married Fabio Dilella. This man was the love of her life. At the time of the fatal accident, he was also 34 years old. The couple had known each other for many years before deciding to officially formalize their relationship. Fabio was an athletic and quite well-known man, a talented soccer player who showed excellent results at the amateur level. He played for the city team and regularly performed at matches for Vasto. In 2015, the soccer player even debuted in Serie D as a reserve player. Roberta's entire family was very proud of his achievements. When the future spouses met, Roberta was working at the bakery owned by Fabio's father. He ran his own business and owned one of the most famous bakeries in town. From the moment they met and began their relationship, everyone around them could see their genuine feelings and considered their union an example of true love. That's why Roberta's sudden death became a terrible blow to both families at once. After all formalities were completed, preparations for the funeral ceremony began on July 3, 2016. Roberta's remains were brought to the church, which proved too small for the huge number of people who came to say goodbye. Relatives and friends of the deceased filled the church to capacity, with a significant portion of attendees forced to remain outside, waiting their turn to pay their last respects to the victim of the tragic event. The funeral service was conducted by the same priest who had blessed Roberta and Fabio's marriage on October 3, 2015. Back then, of course, no one could have predicted that less than 9 months later, the young wife would cross the threshold of this church again, but this time to be laid to rest. This tragic event completely shattered Fabio's normal life. From the first day, it was evident how difficult it was for him to accept the loss of his beloved. After the farewell ceremony, the family couldn't accept that Roberta's life had been cut short by mere chance. They sought revenge and demanded punishment for the one they considered guilty of her death. Among everyone, Fabio showed the most rage. The widower categorically rejected the version of an accident and was convinced that the young man had deliberately hit his wife. He insisted on a thorough investigation, hoping the culprit would receive the harshest punishment possible. Law enforcement representatives were actively working on the case. The Carabinieri interviewed all witnesses to the event, but none of them had noticed unusual or aggressive driving behavior from Italo. Witnesses described him as a calm driver who didn't endanger other road users. Several interviewed admitted they hadn't noticed Roberta at all, explaining that the small scooter was barely visible on the road. The investigation obtained recordings from 3 surveillance cameras installed at the intersection. Thanks to this, the moment of collision was captured from different angles. Experts thoroughly analyzed all video recordings. Additionally, footage was collected showing the movement of both accident participants before the collision. The recordings showed that both drivers were following traffic rules and behaving adequately right up to the moment when Italo ran the red light. Despite this, Fabio refused to believe in the objectivity of the investigation. He continued to claim that the young man had consciously violated the rules and was possibly under the influence of drugs. The widower completely ignored the official toxicology test results that confirmed all accident participants were sober. In his anger, he turned Italo's entire family against him, which wasn't difficult considering how attached everyone was to Roberta. According to Italian law, as in most countries, causing death by negligence is punished much more leniently than intentional murder. To qualify the act as murder requires substantial evidence of intent. Investigators tried to find additional circumstances, but apart from running the red light, there was no evidence of intentional actions. This situation only intensified Fabio's rage. On July 15, 2016, he organized a memorial march in memory of his deceased wife, attended by dozens of people. The widower demanded fair punishment for the person responsible for the tragedy. Hundreds of citizens responded to his call, despite heavy rain. The procession walked through the streets of Vasto, participants shouting slogans against the killer, while Fabio himself didn't hold back in his expressions. Many march participants came to honor Roberta's memory and express support for demands to punish the fatal accident. However, Fabio's excessively aggressive and provocative behavior surprised many present. The atmosphere was permeated not just with grief, but with palpable hatred that the widower openly demonstrated toward Italo. Even before the memorial event, accusations and harsh statements about the young driver began spreading on social media. Italo's family considered such dissemination of negative information inappropriate. They defended the young man, claiming that in real life he was nothing like what Fabio was trying to portray him as. In their opinion, The guy had made a tragic mistake but had done so unintentionally and wasn't a murderer. The situation attracted the attention of the prosecutor handling Roberta's death case. Fabio's aggressive behavior was only curbed after a warning about possible harassment charges. Although the widower stopped public attacks on the guy, he continued turning people against Italo in everyday interactions. This especially strongly affected members of Roberta's and Fabio's families. On the widower's initiative, a large portrait of the deceased was installed at Roberta's grave, and a bench was placed at the accident site as a memorial. Initially, the burial site was regularly visited by numerous relatives and friends who came to pay their respects. Almost all of them encountered Fabio there, regardless of the time of visit. The man could be found at the grave at any hour of the day. While other family members tried to cope with the pain of loss, the grief-stricken widower demonstrated increasingly unusual behavior. He quit his job and spent entire days at the cemetery near his wife's grave. The first day after the funeral, he came there to pray and stayed for a couple of hours before going home. But by the end of the first week, he began spending many hours there, and then started coming for the entire day. Fabio began bringing food with him, having lunch and dinner right by the burial site. His actions increasingly resembled signs of mental disorder. The man couldn't accept his beloved's death. He would appear at the cemetery right after the gates opened and leave only just before closing. The condition worsened with each day. Several times Fabio was spotted on the grounds after the cemetery's official closing time. At first, he was detained at the gates, but then he began climbing over the fence. Cemetery workers discovered that the grief-stricken man had started spending nights at his wife's grave. The situation reached the point where he was practically at the cemetery around the clock and refused to leave. When relatives asked about such behavior, Fabio replied that his wife's burial site was the only place where he felt a spiritual connection with the deceased and found any consolation. At other times, he couldn't find peace, constantly thinking about the injustice of her premature death. The man categorically refused to acknowledge the fact that his wife was no longer among the living. Relatives tried to provide support, but Fabio became increasingly irritable and unpredictable in his reactions. It was enough for someone to accidentally mention Roberta's name for him to instantly fly into a rage and demonstrate aggressive behavior. The widower completely stopped working, nothing interested him anymore except visiting the grave. He claimed that money had proven powerless to save Roberta and therefore had lost all meaning for him. Relatives began seriously worrying about Fabio's mental state, which was clearly unstable. The only thing that gave them hope was the expectation that the man would calm down after Italo received his deserved punishment. Against the backdrop of such unusual behavior, Fabio's brother suggested taking a trip to Rome, hoping a change of scenery would help distract from heavy thoughts. Fabio first looked at his relative with distrust, then sharply declared that he had lost his mind. After all, such a trip would mean leaving his wife alone at the cemetery. The widower again began talking about Italo, claiming he should spend the rest of his days behind bars for his heinous crime. The only thing that brought Fabio any comfort was the fact that the investigation into the accident case was continuing. The man eagerly awaited the moment when the person guilty of the tragedy would be sentenced to long imprisonment. That's why subsequent events became an even bigger blow to him. A few days before Christmas, Italo's defender managed to discover circumstances that mitigated his client's guilt. The first circumstance was the young man's active volunteer work. His social activity in this area was so significant that it brought real benefit to society. Many people were found willing to give Italo the best character references and testify to his positive impact on their lives. The second circumstance, Italo had always dreamed of becoming a firefighter and aspired to serve society. His past contained no offenses whatsoever, there was no criminal history at all. Even traffic violations hadn't been recorded before this incident. Additionally, detailed analysis of video materials from intersection cameras revealed that Roberta herself had violated safety rules. The recordings clearly showed that the woman was operating the scooter without a protective helmet. At the same time, Italo's car's speed didn't exceed the allowed limit, he was following the speed limit, although he had run the red light. Experts concluded that using a helmet could have prevented the severe traumatic brain injury, and the woman would likely have survived the collision. Fabio came to the preliminary hearing in Roberta's death case, hoping for the triumph of justice. When he heard the defense attorney's arguments regarding mitigating circumstances, the man was seized by an attack of uncontrollable fury. Several family members had to physically restrain him, as everyone feared Fabio might attack the defendant. The judge took into account the mitigating circumstances presented by the defense, finding the lawyer's arguments sufficiently convincing. Even Roberta's family didn't know that she had neglected to use a helmet. In the eyes of those present, the defendant no longer looked like the cruel criminal Fabio had portrayed him as. However, the widower himself continued to see him as a monster deserving the harshest punishment. A date for the next hearing was set, after which everyone left the courtroom. Italo remained free at least until the completion of the trial. Leaving the courthouse, Fabio stared long and piercingly at the young man with a look full of hatred. After these events, during the Christmas holidays, Fabio's relatives noticed that his obsession with Roberta's memory had reached a critical point. He spent several consecutive days at his beloved's grave, almost the entire time kneeling in prayer. This time the man hadn't even brought food with him, which caused serious concern. When Fabio somewhat recovered from the emotional shock, he told relatives that the cemetery was the only place where he felt any spiritual peace. When asked about the lack of food, the man smiled and replied that he didn't feel hungry at all. Everyone was very worried about Fabio's mental health, but any attempts to convince him to see a doctor led to shouting and conflicts. Parents, brother, and Roberta's relatives repeatedly tried to persuade him to visit a psychiatrist for consultation, but all attempts were futile. The only thing occupying his thoughts besides his wife was the inability of the law enforcement system to properly punish, as he saw it, the treacherous criminal Italo. The main court hearing was scheduled for February 21, 2017. However, having heard the young man's lawyer's justifications and observing the judge's reactions, Fabio lost hope for a harsh sentence. Hatred completely consumed him. He now sought not just justice, but revenge. Judging by conversations with loved ones, the man had completely lost faith in the justice system. By the end of 2016, Fabio had become extremely withdrawn, almost stopping communication with relatives. When he wasn't at his wife's grave, he would lock himself in his room, reliving the past. He ate almost nothing, and the once attractive man had turned into a shadow of his former self. Everyone worried about his health, completely forgetting about some important facts. 10 years before the described events, Fabio had obtained a firearms license. Throughout all the following years, he regularly visited the shooting range, improving his shooting skills. What had long been an ordinary hobby now began to seem like the only possible solution to him. Even more disturbing was the fact that in September 2016, Fabio had completely legally purchased a 9mm caliber pistol. He had all the necessary documents and appropriate level of training for such a purchase. At the end of December 2016, Fabio's parents noticed radical changes in his social media page design. The man was posting gloomy entries with pessimistic reflections. He also posted on his profile a scene from the movie Gladiator, where the main character returns from war and discovers his entire family has been murdered. Acquaintances decided that this was his way of experiencing the pain of loss and had found his reflection in the movie character. In reality, this indicated not just his grief and desire for justice. From now on, the man was driven by a desire for revenge. He was convinced that the law enforcement system had sided not with good, but was supporting the criminal. The sluggishness and inefficiency of the judicial machine had turned into a mockery of Roberta's memory. Relatives couldn't imagine that the once good-natured Fabio would take up arms, and the publication of the movie frame indicated his intention to take justice into his own hands. After this, the man posted several more entries on his page, all related to the search for justice. However, he left no direct hints or indications of his future intentions. Rather, these were abstract reflections and philosophical questions behind which something much more threatening was hidden. On February 1, 2017, Italo went to a bar on Via Purti Street in Vasto. He regularly visited this establishment to relax, and had been going there more frequently lately for obvious reasons. The young man talked at length with friends and acquaintances, having a very hard time dealing with the tragedy involving Roberta. The young man repeatedly stated his readiness to face justice and accept any court decision, even serve time if the court so decided. That day Italo came to the bar again seeking support, unable to stop thinking about the upcoming hearing scheduled in 3 weeks. The only difference between this visit and previous ones was that at the entrance he encountered Fabio. This meeting seemed unusual, as Italo knew the man lived on the opposite side of town, and their paths had never crossed before. They exchanged a few brief remarks when suddenly Fabio pulled out his 9mm pistol and fired 3 shots. He caught Italo during a phone conversation. The young man's father was on the other end of the line. The first bullet hit Italo's stomach, the second wounded his leg, the third struck his neck. The young man immediately fell, bleeding profusely. The neck wound proved fatal, the artery was damaged. Other bar patrons ran out at the sound of gunshots, but the guy died before the ambulance arrived. Fabio immediately got in his car and disappeared from the crime scene. When medics arrived at the bar, they could only pronounce Italo dead. The Carabinieri immediately interviewed witnesses, and thanks to their testimony, the shooter's identity was quickly established. Law enforcement arrived at Fabio's family home, where relatives indicated where he could be found. The Carabinieri headed to Roberta's grave, expecting to find the killer's lifeless body there, assuming he would most likely take his own life. Instead, they discovered a semi-automatic pistol in a plastic bag on the tombstone. Subsequent ballistic examination confirmed that this was the weapon used to kill Italo. The father of the deceased young man later made an official statement. He insisted that Roberta's death had been a tragic accident. Italo's father knew that his son would never have done anything like that intentionally. The boy wouldn't even get behind the wheel after a beer. In his opinion, Italo shouldn't have paid with his life for a tragic accident, especially considering that Roberta herself hadn't taken full care of her own safety. A few hours after the murder, Fabio was found. Before surrendering to authorities, the man called a friend, confessed to killing the person he considered responsible for his wife's death, and said he was going to the cemetery to say goodbye to Roberta. Only then did the man reveal the real reason why he had taken his wife's loss so hard. That evening when she was heading to her parents' house, the woman had planned to prepare a festive dinner and share joyful news. She had learned she was pregnant. Roberta was expecting Fabio's child, though the pregnancy was still early. Until that moment, the man had been the only one who knew this and understood the full scale of the tragedy. Besides his wife's death in the accident, his unborn child had also died, which was a double blow for Fabio. After Italo's death, his father continued defending his son's good name from the slander spread on the internet and in real life. All these arguments were supposed to be heard in court so the young man wouldn't receive the same harsh punishment as real criminals with malicious intent. The father considered Fabio's actions unfair to his son. Fabio had created such an atmosphere of hatred around the boy that the entire country branded Italo a murderer. In reality, according to the boy's father, he had become a victim of circumstances. The man emphasized that his son wanted to help people, dreamed of becoming a firefighter, which was why he was actively involved in volunteer work. Italo wasn't an evil person. He had a very hard time dealing with Roberta's death and repeatedly shared his feelings with his father, stating that the only moment in life he would want to change was running that red light. The father of the deceased young man grieved deeply. He created an improvised memorial in front of the bar where his son was shot, placed his photograph there with candles, and came daily to honor his memory. Public opinion on the situation was divided. There were those who supported the deceased woman's husband, believing Fabio had done right by taking revenge on the one who had taken his wife and child. Others believed the widower had acted too harshly and categorically. In their opinion, he should have waited for the court's decision. Italo would surely have received a fair verdict that would have appeased the widower. After Italo's murder, Fabio's parents expressed condolences to the boy's family. They reported that 2 days before the crime they had contacted a medical center. When Fabio's unpredictable behavior reached a critical limit, they realized he needed qualified psychiatric help, even if he had to be hospitalized by force. They drew the doctor's attention to the fact that the man's behavior had completely spiraled out of control, expressed concerns about his mental health, and requested hospitalization. Unfortunately, bureaucratic obstacles and the system's slowness prevented this from happening in time. If Fabio's parents' request had been processed promptly, he would have been immediately hospitalized, and perhaps the second tragedy could have been avoided. On February 4, 2017, Italo's coffin stood in a church in Vasto. The ceremony was attended by numerous friends and relatives of the deceased. The funeral service was conducted by the same priest who had previously spoken about Roberta's sudden death. He had witnessed the tragic development of events, so he called on those present for prudence and mutual respect. The priest asked to avoid hatred, including manifestations on social media. In this difficult time, the pastor wanted people to unite and stop the bloodshed. Instead of hearings regarding Roberta's death, which were discontinued due to the defendant's death, Fabio found himself in court charged with first-degree murder. His lawyer tried to dispute premeditation and reduce liability due to his client's severe mental state. This would have allowed avoiding life imprisonment. However, the prosecution had convincing evidence to the contrary. On March 24, 2017, the court found Fabio Dilella guilty and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. The lawyer continued to insist on the sharp deterioration of his client's mental state after the death of his beloved wife. The man couldn't cope with her loss and continue normal life, and necessary help hadn't arrived in time. The lawyer filed an appeal, and additional examinations were conducted. On July 10, 2018, the appeals court reduced the prison term to 20 years. This was achieved by diagnosing an acute mental disorder from which Fabio was suffering at the time of the attack. However, the prosecution wasn't satisfied with this decision. They insisted on reinstating the 30-year prison term. On November 13, 2019, the Court of Cassation rejected the appeals. As a result, the 20-year sentence became the final decision. The first period of imprisonment was extremely difficult for Fabio, with a psychiatrist and priest working with him regularly. There was a high risk of suicide attempts. Later the man's condition improved, and the threat level was reduced. As far as is known, Fabio is still serving his sentence and will be released only in 2037. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.